Hello, Strat fans. I'm Jimmy James, and this is Strat-O-logy, the show for and by students of Strat-O-Matic. On today's show, we're gonna talk AutoDraft. Those that play Strat 365 know that there's an amazing way to set up teams other than a live draft. Really great because it allows for a ton more leagues to get started up with players from different places and different time zones. And it is a little different from the live draft probably everybody listening to me right now has done at least once in their life. We will not only get into what it is, but we also will talk to our roundtable to get a few of their strategies. So, with that said, sit back, grab your cards and dice, and let's roll! Because today we're talking Strat 365, I wanted to share two big things that just happened. First, now you can see the records for each set. When you look at the set browser, there's an extra tab. So cool. You guys should check it out. Who knows? Maybe your team or one of your players might be there. Second, the new limited run set is 1998. In a few weeks, we're going to have an episode where we take a deep dive into the set. Okay, let's get started with...
Sir Strat of the Round Table.
We are here on Sir Strat of the Round Table. I have with me today Sir Tony.
Thanks for having me, James. Glad to be here.
Sir Peter.
Hey, man, how are you?
And Sir John.
Hi, Jimmy James. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you guys so much for being here. Our topic today is the AutoDraft for Strat 365. It's something that I think is original, I think, to Strat. I haven't ever played any fantasy sports that had an AutoDraft before. Have you guys?
I'm not.
No.
Oh,
Yeah, I think this is the first. So I thought a good place for us to start out with is just going through the rules section of this type of draft because of how it's different. I mean, I think almost everybody that's probably listening has done a live draft before, but no doubt an auto draft is a little bit different. Looking at the Strat 365 website in the rules section, in an auto draft, you take as long as you want, filling out your draft card with the best players that fit under the salary cap. Once the league fills, our auto draft system sorts out all the draft cards and automatically places players in everybody's rosters based on how you've ranked them. Once you started your team, before you join a league, you specify which 25 players you want on your team, which ballpark you'd like to call home. Each available player has a salary. You must make sure all 25 players fit under your chosen salary cap. Keep in mind you intend to play a DH or a non-DH league and make your choices accordingly. And not say right there, not all the sets are 25-man sets. You know, some of them actually go down all the way to 23. Please note that since other managers in your league may choose some of the same players, you will likely lose out on some of the players you select when the auto draft is run. In that case, the system will attempt to find a suitable replacement for players it couldn't give to you. And a lot of that is what we'll be talking about today and getting these guys strategy on how they handle that. To add a player to your draft card, click on the draft link under either pitchers or hitters section to bring up the list of available. I think that section is pretty self-explanatory. This is an interesting one. Do you have to draft hitters at every position? Technically, no, but we strongly recommend that you do. You then rank your players, select your ballpark, and you join a league. Once the league fills, 10 minutes after that, it runs the auto draft, and then you go from there. At that point, you have your waivers. I thought, the real place for us to start with is any type of things that you guys can think of, especially misconceptions that you've heard out there, or anything how the auto draft runs. Do you guys have anything that you guys have heard before?
I think for some of the misconceptions, I mean, really, a lot of it has to do with the positions that you have to draft. I mean, of course, if you look at the rules, you don't have to draft each position. But a lot of people think they have to draft a player and a backup for each position. I know there have been some leagues where the draft has just gone kind of awry, and somebody, especially a newbie to 365, has drafted basically a backup almost for each position, and then he couldn't quite figure out. So that is definitely not the case. You don't have to. You could draft just one person each position and assortment of backups. Build your bench, but definitely do not have to have a backup for each position.
Yeah, so I would say one of the big misconceptions or mistakes that I see people making is really just not understanding the rules. So they don't know that, if they try and get the same or going after the same player in round one that another player is, that, it's a random decision made by the draft algorithm to decide which one of those two teams the player goes to. So I think there's a lot of confusion by some players when their draft doesn't work out the way that they expect, just based on that. And just to reiterate what Sir Peter was saying, that drafting of every position, that's definitely a misconception. It's a strategy I actually use in some sets where I purposefully won't draft a player at a certain position, like the 90s mystery set, for example. There's so many, similar slugging first basemen that I'll often leave first baseman right off the draft card. I know in the waivers, I can get one that's, a 30 home run type guy that I can plug in there. So it allows me to make, prioritize other spots in the draft.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that it's right there on their rules, because that is a thing that you wouldn't think of. Yeah, there's no reason other than catcher that you have to draft a first baseman or that you have to draft a second baseman. That's a very interesting take there, John. What about you, Sir Tony? What do you think?
No, that is very interesting. And I've learned a lot of that just from the most recent drafts that I've been in. And that's a very good point John brings up. I never really thought of that. I'd like to get my players that I want, but yeah, obviously there's an option not to pick a first baseman, a third baseman, et cetera, et cetera. And I think you're right. You do have to at least have two catchers, right, on your draft card.
Yes.
And I also think you have to have 5 guys that can start, right? So if you're going with 4 asterisks, you need at least a starter reliever in there, am I right? Or it won't run properties. It'll tell you, right? You have to have 5 guys that can start, correct? So that's another thing that some of the newbies do. They don't realize that you have to have those 5 guys that can start. Yeah, and when you were talking about, don't have to draft the backup at every position, I do like to try to draft at least maybe one guy that can play the infield, one guy that can play all 3 outfield positions. And that's just all personal preference for me.
Yep.
But, but again, it's hard sometimes to understand. It's like I always try to put in a top closer. 2 or 3 other guys have a top closer. So what I'm learning is maybe I don't want the top. I think John alluded to that with the first baseman thing. Maybe I want to go down the list to maybe the 3rd or 4th best closer. And maybe I have a better chance to get that, right? Because I believe, and I could be wrong again, but I believe if everybody's going for the same player in the first position, there's some kind of algorithm or rule or something that determines who gets what, right? So it's strictly random. Am I right on that at that point?
Yes.
Correct.
In fact, I think that's a good thing for us to go into a little bit, because I would say the biggest misconception I've heard is I hear people saying, oh, he got the first pick. Oh, I got the last pick. It's like their whole team got, the computer just said, okay, he's number 1, so he gets all his guys, and this guy gets the second pick, so he gets all the second guys, not understanding that each round, the guy you have in the first position, it's handled completely individual from the player that everybody has in the second position. In the first position, if 2 of us have that same person, then the computer is going to random number generate, and if it's a 1 through 5, it's mine. If it's a 6 through 10, it's his. It's going to be split that way. And if it's 3, it's going to be 33% for each person having that. And then if you don't get that person, you're going to get the next closest person that isn't on anybody else's draft list anywhere on that. And that's a very specific thing, because a lot of people don't get that either. I mean, me and John were just talking about that about a week or 2 ago, and when we first came up with the idea for this topic, that's really kind of where it came from, was that concept. So I really kind of think that's the biggest thing is people don't understand that it's round by round. So you can get totally unlucky round 1, and then rounds 2 through 10, you may hit all your guys even though somebody else wanted them.
Well, in terms of giving you a guide, does it go by salary? Does it go by defensive rankings? think it goes by strictly pure salary, right?
Salary.
So that's what it's going for.
Salary.
Right?
Yeah,
salary. It'll
at-
go by
at the-
position first, and then salary second.
See, that's the frustrating thing for me is because I'm a defensive guy. When I put in for a 1 at third base and I get stuck with a 4 there, I get frustrated. But at the end of the day, though, it's giving me like a $5 million player for a $5 million player, if that makes sense.
We'll come back to that because
Yeah.
that's in the second segment when we really go into our draft strategies. I kind of have a strategy that kind of fits in with that and how that works in my favor at times and can cloud my judgment on positively and negatively on which guys I'm going to go and which guys I'm going to put in a row because maybe I'm willing to get the guy right below him. Okay, that is what well for this segment. We will be right back after this.
You're listening to the 365 Sportscast Network, the streaming future of sports talk radio. Listen to us round the clock on the net over 365sportscast.com. On your phone with the 365 Sportscast app, and on your favorite smart speaker by enabling the 365 Sportscast skill and saying, "Play 365 Sports." The views, opinions, and content of the show hosts and their guests appearing are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of 365 Sportscast LLC, its owners and partners, or this network.
Sir Strat of the Round Table.
Okay, we are back. I'm here again with Sir Tony, Sir Peter, and Sir John. Now we are going to go into general draft strategies that each one of us really like to use. So why don't you start out, Sir John?
Sure. So, in thinking about this, there's kind of three general practices that I use when I'm trying to put together my draft card. The first one, maybe I could tell you what all three are, and then we could dive into each one. So the first one is, obviously trying to get what players I want as best I can in the draft. The second one is ensuring I have a plan B in case I don't get those players. And then the third one is considering what I can do to improve my waiver position after the draft. So, the first one, like I said, is obvious. You're trying to rank the players you covet the most higher than when you think your opponents will rank them. And you can do that strategically to improve your chances. Like, if you think someone's sort of a middle of the round guy, but you really want him, he's someone that fills out the type of team you want. Maybe you put him, into your top 5 just to guarantee you get him. You could also, decide who you're putting on your draft card based on, how popular you think players are. You might say, what? I think everyone's going after Robin Yount at shortstop. Maybe I'll target Alan Trammell, that kind of thing.
Actually, I use that in the tournament. What I will do is I will go back and I will take a look at who the teams that those guys, the better guys, or if any of the guys are in my division, I will go back and look at the guys that they have drafted in prior years because that'll influence on how high I put guys up because I'll be like, I really want that guy. Normally, I probably would only pick him 6th or 7th. But you know what? That guy likes him. So you know what? Maybe I better put him 2nd or 3rd because I'm going to build around that.
Yeah. And on that note, speaking to that, having a plan B, like using the example of, maybe Alan Trammell again, let's say in the 80s mystery set. Like if I have a real strong preference for that type of player, like a one at shortstop, like a lot of us do, if you're going after Trammell with one of your top couple of picks, sometimes I'll throw in a Tony Fernandez or Rick Burleson or someone like that a little lower down and try and beat everyone else to that player so that if, my plan A of Trammell doesn't work out, I can still carry forward with the team I want with a one shortstop with one of those guys.
I've used that strategy at catcher, right? Because I like to have good defensive catchers. So I have put in my number one catcher in the top 3 or 4 because, like I said, got to be strong up the middle in my mind. And then I'll put the backup catcher like in the top 11. And 9 out of 10 times that's been a successful strategy. Now, you'd also mentioned earlier that example where, you're trying to see how the other people do and what they have a history of doing. So played the one series a few times, and it seems like Larry Walker was always on number 1 on my card and always went. There was one time where Larry Walker, nobody had him on his card, and he ended up being a free agent because maybe everybody thought that was going to be the guy that everybody's going to have in the top 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. and nobody did. So it's just an interesting sidebar to what you were talking about.
Yeah. And I think the other part of plan B is considering, as Jimmy James mentioned earlier, think about what player you might get if you don't get the player, as a consolation. So, probably my favorite example of that is in the 70s mystery set. Willie Stargell is a popular player. So if if you're trying to get him in the second or third round or even the first, you might not get him. Well, the next two left fielders in salary after him are Jim Rice and George Foster. So if they go undrafted and you're high, in taking Stargell, you might land on one of those, and it's really a nice consolation prize. Whereas, the similar thing on that same set in right field, if you go after Dave Parker and you don't get him, the next guys after him are guys like Ellis Valentine, Sixto Loscano, just not, the same type of player that you're probably looking for. So even in putting that original draft card together, you can consider things like that. Like, what will I get, what will I end up with if I don't get that player?
Well, and here's a situation I've seen multiple times where the first shortstop is really great, both offensive and defensively. The second one is great only offensively, and then number 3, 4, and 5 are both good. Are all three good defensively? I'm more likely to go after number 3 because if I don't get number 1, I'm going to be stuck with that bad defense. If I don't get number 3, maybe I get number 4, maybe I get number 5. That's kind of what I was referring to in the last segment, Tony. I'm not only playing for that guy, I'm playing for the guys right underneath him sometimes, because if one of those guys is not on anybody's card, I'm willing to go with that. Even though it's not my original plan, I can do that. I can't remember which set it is. It's maybe the 90s set, but it's probably the 80s set. The Robin Yount card where he's in center field. He's actually a better shortstop than he is a center fielder. But if you take him with your first pick and you don't get him, you're not going to get another shortstop at that level. You're going to end up with 2 center fielders. And you're going to need to trade for a shortstop, or you're going to get stuck with a bad defensive shortstop. And I love that card, but I am afraid of that card because of that thing, is because there is no plan B at all with that card. It is it. If you don't get it, you are out of luck.
Yeah, and in that example, Jimmy James, then the center fielders after Yount in that 80 set is, it's quite a drop-off. It's guys that maybe don't really fit with what you're doing. Lenny Dykstra, Brett Butler, some of those guys, center fielders, Gorman Thomas. There's different types of players, but it's no Robin Yount. And to your point, you were trying to get a shortstop with that pick, and you probably have other plans for center field.
Yeah.
I agree. And let's talk now about your third one, because this is an area that actually I would say is probably my weakest, but I pride myself on getting a lot of my guys usually. But setting yourself up for waivers, because I'm positive this is going to come up again when we talk with Sir Peter in just a minute.
Yeah. So, it's not a strategy I use all the time, but sometimes I'll definitely consider trying to get that waiver position. So again, the waiver priority is based on the weight of the draft picks that you lose on your draft card. So if you're going after, so let's say it's a set where there's a minimum 24 players. If you and I are both going after Robin Yount and I don't get him, I get 24 points towards that waiver priority. In some sets, you're going to get a really, really good player, a star centerpiece of your team with that top waiver priority. So in some sets, I think that, my experience is that happens more. In the 60s mystery set, you tend to have a lot of those, 8 million plus guys I find left after the draft and available in waivers. So knowing that, sometimes I'll take a strategy where I'll jam the top of my draft card with, those expensive players, the Willie Mays, Frank Robinson, Hank Aaron. And, I might hit on 1 or 2 of those. And if I don't, I'm, improving, I'm getting those waiver points. And then, if I have first waiver, maybe there's, an Al Kaline or someone of that nature that's still available in waivers.
That Al Kaline is often available in that 60s mystery set. Okay, so, let's go on to our next. How about you, Sir Peter? What is your draft strategy?
So I have one strategy for essentially all my drafts. And I approach every single draft the same exact way. So obviously I take my cap, I figure out sort of a per player price. So in my experience with Strat-O-Matic, and all of my success in Strat-O-Matic has been with very even teams that don't hit a whole bunch of home runs, lead the league in home runs, but they really, don't pitch very well. Ones that pitch, with, above average, and teams that hit, at above average. So I want to make sure I have the most amount of money at each position possible. So the number one thing is always for me is the back end of my bullpen. And as we've stated before, the back end of my bullpen is always number one. Just for reference, our new season that we're playing with, the 1982 season, my number 1 and 2 picks were Goose Gossage and Dan Quisenberry. So those were number 1 and 2. I will always I like to go with the asterisk pitchers. So I always like to go with 4 asterisk pitchers. Sometimes I will go with the Brett Saberhagen and Sid Fernandez combo in the 90 set, just because I know sometimes with when I'm playing with other players, I know they're going for the Greg Maddux, the Pedro Martinez, and I'll kind of save myself from aggravation of trying to kind of get back there after the draft happens. But for the most part, I go with 4 pitchers, and after I build my pitching staff, I'll have really 2 top back end relievers, really a middleman and a closer, 4, asterisk pitchers, really 2 top tier pitchers, and then 2 mid tier pitchers. When I'm saying, I'm kind of looking at the Lamar Hoyts of the 80 sets, that kind of mid tier, and then kind of spend some middle relief pitchers, the 1.5, the Jeff Reardons, the Graham Lloyds, those kind of pitchers. I'll take those kind of guys, and then I'll figure out how much money I have left, and I'll basically divide it by position, or by how many positions I have left, and I'll figure out exactly how much money I have. Then with that, I will draft a backup catcher, always under 1 million, just high defensive catcher for under 1 million, a backup infielder, and this infielder usually has some parameters for me. It's somebody who can play second, third, and short, or at least second and short, and at minimum are at the worst there are 3 defensively. Then I will draft somebody who's strictly an on base guy who has a high on base average. And these are all under $1 million players, high on base guys. So for a pinch hitter, I don't care. I don't really want a pinch hitter who hits home runs. I want a pinch hitter who's getting on base. And then usually another defensive outfielder replacement, somebody who can. You'll always find that one in the set who can place, left, center, and right, and they're all like a 2-1. Pat Sheridan's a good example of that, somebody in the 80 set that I like. And then from that, I will take my draft and I will extrapolate out exactly how much money I have, and I will start drafting from there. Okay. So, and then you kind of figure it out. Now, to John's point about waivers, I'll go ahead and rank my players. And of course, in that order of importance, that I don't always top load it with pitchers. I will put my shortstops, my second baseman, my center fielders, and obviously my left fielder is always that high, good defensive, high power guy, big OPS guy. So all those positions will always be high up. But then I start ranking them. And now really where I start getting strategic, if you will, what I do is I'll take the bottom half of my lineup. And again, I like to have very even teams, but for the most part, if you can have a strong shortstop, strong second baseman, strong center fielder, and obviously 3 good starting pitchers with at least 1 strong, super strong reliever, you're going to have a good team. So what I'll do is I'll actually aim I'll rank my players where I may think I might not get them. Those kind of that 12 to 24 pick where I really think I might not get them. So I'm convinced with the way I know the sets and the way I know the league that between the picks number 1 to 12, I'll probably get 7 to 9 of those 12 guys, and I'm good with that. The rest of those, I feel that if I get them, I will. Good for me because I wanted them anyway. I picked those guys, but if I don't, my waiver status keeps going up and up and up and up. What a lot of the times what will happen for me is I will get the core of guys that I'm looking for in the top 12, and then I'll still have a top 4, top 3 waiver pick. So really, I'll have a whole bunch of extra money. I'll have a whole bunch of expendable guys that I may end up getting in a draft. And then I can really pick apart a waiver wire that way. And I can start picking and choosing. So that's really, I mean, I know it's sort of a long-winded way of drafting, but that is the strategy. That is the draft strategy I attack all the time. And it's been very successful for me. And the only time the whole waiver thing doesn't work out for me is when I get the team I wanted in the first. And then I'm okay with not really getting what I want on waivers. But I would say 95% of the time I'm drafting, this is almost to a T of what I would do.
And let me clarify one thing. It's when you're picking who you want, you pick all the cheaper guys. It's not that you put them high on your ranking. It's that when you're deciding the people you're going to draft, you've already decided who the backups are going to be because of where the value is and how much you're going to have to spend on them. Correct?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I'm sorry if it wasn't clear. Yeah, that's exactly.
I just wanted to make sure it wasn't both, that you weren't also putting them in your draft list high. You're putting them lower in your draft list than those cheaper players.
Correct. Yeah, correct. They still are and I'll take those guys that I draft first, the backup catchers. Basically, as soon as I do that, all of my backup catchers and my throwaway relievers, I will just put them all to the bottom of the list. And then from the bottom of my list, then I'll start ranking them in a place where I know I won't necessarily get them, and I don't necessarily care, because then my waiver points start going up and up and up. Yeah, but for the most part, yeah, I really every once in a while I will. I have done it in the past just to kind of play around, where I'll just kind of rank some guys out, a little wonky, but it's never really worked out. I try, because I did that to try to learn the waiver system or how to, manipulate the waiver system in my advantage.
Oh, really good stuff. How about you, Sir Tony? What are some of your general draft strategies?
Well, I touched a little bit earlier when I was getting into John's points about the catcher. I do like to have, like Peter said, I like to have a starting catcher. I like to have a backup catcher, but I'm greedy. I want ones. I want ones everywhere. Defense. So one thing I do that seems to be different than what these other guys are doing here, I'm not so much into salary as I am into positioning. Is it a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4 defensively? If it's a DH here, I will look for that, that home run guy that can hit some power, that don't even bring a glove to the field, that kind of stuff. But for the most part, I'm looking at the best defensive shortstop I want. And then I pick mine like from the defense out, if that makes sense. Right. And then I just try to slot them on the card. So I got to the point where, I'm very successful sometimes at getting 2 really good catchers, because I will put the backup catcher and value that just as high as I do like a second starter type, if that makes sense. So as I said earlier, I'll make my starting catcher usually in the top 3. My good defensive infielder, shortstop specifically, I'll try to put him at 1, right? 1 or 2. I like to grab closers, right? Good back end closer guys. I'll put them towards the top of the card. Most of the time, this is proven successful for me. The last league that I was in, it was a single season. It didn't work out that way, but then I did end up getting the best player in the waiver process because I only got a handful of what I was looking for. So I guess in these single seasons where, you don't have as many players to choose from, maybe that strategy needs to be thought of a little deeper, like Peter and John do, and you too, James, because of the numbers of free agents that will be left behind. Does that make sense? So like in a league that I was in with the single season, there just isn't as many players, right? Salary cap was a normal default cap at 80 million, right? So I didn't get that strategy didn't work as well because a lot of players were looking for the same players I was. But then in the end result was I got the number 1 waiver claim. And as far as I try to get ballparks that fit what I like to do. So like if I get a ballpark moderate in singles, right, lefty, righty, try to get as close to even as I can between like 8 and 12. So because I look at it this way, the other team hits there, but I do too. So if when I first started doing this, I would pick like single 1 to 3. And I'm like, wait, I can't hit singles either. So that's not a problem. So that's a problem. So, I kind of up that a little bit on the ballpark, but I try to keep home run ballparks low. So I'm playing in one right now, Comiskey, in a single season in 1982, where, It's single 1 to 10 lefty righty, very even, consistent for me and the other team. But the home runs are homer one, fly out otherwise, right? So now I can take these moderate pitchers. Like Peter said, he tries to get one really good starter. I try to get moderate starters, all asterisks, middle of the road guys, pitchers maybe grade out money wise, somewhere around 4 million and under, 4 million to 2 million, if that makes sense. It's because I think I could take. If I get these defensive players that I need, that makes those pitchers better in bigger parks. Does that make sense? So that's kind of like what I try to do whenever I'm doing my draft strategy and my draft card. So I haven't always been successful, and I learned a little bit more along the way. So like maybe in these seasons with not as many players, maybe I don't want the best closer. Maybe I want a middle of the road to closer, maybe the number 2 or 3 guy salary wise, and try to get that guy and beat, the other guys to that guy, if that makes sense. So that's just some things I've learned over the past, but all things considered in those, not those single seasons, but in those decade ones where there's a lot of players to choose from, this strategy has proved pretty successful for me. Got a very good defensive team. I do get one good defensive outfielder. That's probably a 2 lefty. I'm looking, even if I have to pay 3 or 4 million for that guy, I value that guy that much. So he could play all 3 outfield positions. And I try to do the same, like Peter said, with the infield guy. And if you have a little bit more money than normal because you have to pay for the defense, I still try to get one really good backup defensive player that can play either all 4 infield positions or at least short second, and then maybe a first, third baseman if I have to. So that's kind of what I do.
And one of the things I do want to just a quick go back. One of the things I want to definitely emphasize is that you got to know the set that you're drafting in. And of course, I have a pretty set way of doing things, but where I'll draft certain guys in that top 12 is really dependent on the set. The 1982 set that we're talking about. If you don't take a shortstop in the top 3 picks, you're going to end up with probably a 3 or a 4. In the 80 set, I value obviously. Ozzie Smith is very rarely not. It's a rarity if he's not my number 1 or 2 pick when I'm drafting that set. So you got to know those sets. Like John said earlier, in the 90 set, you could probably put your your first baseman at the 20th pick, because if you don't get who you want, you're gonna find correct me if I'm wrong, but Tino Martinez is always available in that set, on waivers. He's always around. So you got to know your set that you're drafting.
Yeah. And so, Peter, I think part of knowing the set is also knowing what players will be available after the draft in the waivers, right? If you're generally comfortable that, through experience, I've seen that, that there's a pretty good depth available for the type of player I'm looking for at a certain position, then maybe you don't prioritize that, or maybe you decide to go after that top player and you're okay with not getting him and, increasing your waiver chance and then getting that player in waivers.
Right. Yeah.
That is actually would be my very first point, would be knowing the set. Almost every set has flaws. And I think part of having a good draft is being able to exploit those flaws. If we're talking about the 82, there's no relief pitching. There's none. There's only 82 in the entire set, which is nothing if you're playing as a 24-man league. And I do not like to get starter relievers and to play them in the bullpen, because part of the salary you're paying for is his starting ability. So if you have a $3 million starter, he's terrible. But you have a $3 million reliever, he's good. So there's a big disparity. So not only am I looking for straight relievers in that aspect, in this one especially, I picked up 7 relievers that were 5 of them over $3 million because I knew there was none of them available. And I doubted that everybody else knew how few they were. And I exploited that position. And I right now still have 6 of them, but I turned the 7th into a right-handed DH and a very good defensive shortstop, which was one of the things that I had missed. So I still have an ace in the hole that if I've got a couple offers for. Sorry, John. Now I need a guy that hits righties now. So Royster's not on my list because he can only hit them lefties. I need a guy that's got a little more pop on righties. But there's every week that sixth reliever is going to have even more value because the total lack of relief pitching in that. I was willing to trade dollar for dollar for shortstop for relief pitcher. I will not trade dollar for dollar at almost any other position in that set because there are a million more of every other position than relievers, except for we talked about the shortstop. I would actually put third base kind of in that position too, in that set. But there's real limitations in that set. There's real limitations in the 60s mystery set. I take a look at those limitations, and I think that's where you can gain the advantage over other people is exploiting some of those weaknesses in the set. My second point I would probably say would be, because I'm never really thinking about the waiver wire too much. So sometimes with those guys, when there's a lot of guys, let's say, like you said, there's a lot of first basemen, I'll look it through and I'll go, dude, who's an unheralded guy? Who's the guy that you never think of that was, man, dude, he was a pretty dang good hitter, or, he's a lot better at defense than you thought he was. Thornton. I picked him up really late, like in the 12th pick before. And I'm like, man, he's a $6 million player in some sets. He's a real good hitter, and he plays good defense. You just don't think about him when you're talking about that era. He's not one of the flashy names. In fact, one of the guys I didn't go for in the 82 set that you went for in your number 2 pick, I did go for Gossage because he's one of the very best. But one of the $3 million guys is Quisenberry. I did not go for Quisenberry. I didn't want to go for Quisenberry. I didn't want to go for Gene Gerber. Too many guys were going to go for those guys. I knew I wanted to get a chunk of these guys, so I took the Vandenberg, which is with his 2 ERA. And, he's the guy I was able to turn into a shortstop. So I think taking a look at guys that aren't drafted as often can also be a benefit to you because you can still spend that money, but you can spend that money in a much lower position because, I like to do platoons. And especially in yearly sets, like if you're playing a more modern yearly set, there's a lot of great platoons available. If I'm playing a set, maybe I want to move one of those guys up higher so I know I have that great platoon and I'm going to have both sides of it. And then I can get that first baseman. Either, like you said, maybe not even draft one. I've done that recently in our 24-man. Didn't draft a couple positions. And in this side, I really knew that I was going to be drafting a couple guys just to fill out the salary, and I was going to be looking for someone else later. I'll take a guy that he would work, but as long as I got all those relievers, I knew I was going to be able to turn those relievers into something else.
Yeah, and I think, Jimmy James, that's a real strategy that could be used, and I use sometimes. Like, I think there's certain players, and this all comes back to knowing the set and having experience with the set and seeing who gets drafted and who doesn't. But there's certain players who, for whatever reason, just aren't as sexy as others in the draft process, and they always slip through the draft. But then they become very popular once you get into waivers. They're guys that are always taken in the first round of waivers. So once you understand who those are, you can start putting. They could be a really good, $4 or $5 million player. You could put them as low as like 24th on your list, and you'd be surprised you're getting them 8 times out of 10 sometimes because they're just one of those guys that aren't attracting the attention until the waivers comes.
I've done that when we were talking about K-Line. I've done that with K-Line. I put K-Line 24th in a 1960s league and got it.
Yeah, I believe it.
Well, it's either 80s or 90s mystery. I don't remember which one, but Doug Mankiewicz is a guy about $2 million, good defensive player, good on-base percentage. He always seems to be there. One of those guys, John, that always seems to be there, once the waivers run, because he's one of them guys that just doesn't look sexy. He doesn't hit a lot of home runs. He's a first baseman, but he gets on base in the right situation. He can be very productive. So I think that's a little bit about what you're talking about there. The
secret's out on him now, but Ron Coomer in the 90s set used to be that guy. Ron Coomer at first base. Is he the lefty against lefties?
Yeah, he kills lefties.
Yeah, Ron Coomer against lefties. I mean, he was the guy I used to pick up all the time. Now, if I really want to do the first base platoon, I actually have to put him in the top 12 because he's never around anymore. But definitely guys like that. and I will do that often, especially with the bottom half of my players. A lot of times I will pick up players simply for, and again, my strategy is always a strategy to win. So if I can take players away from teams, sometimes that's better than just kind of being out there in the ether. So we can kind of just, again, you have all the relievers, Jimmy, you got them. Other players just don't have them. So even if you can't turn them into a shortstop, guess what? They can't pitch against you. So that's also just a strategy sometimes. I don't necessarily use that always in my draft. However, depending on the league, the size of the league, I will do that. I'll also utilize my waivers for purposes just like that as well. I'll use my waivers to steal players away from the league just to hoard them. And then, I'll turn them, I'll cash them in a rainy day when I need them.
Yeah, Sir Peter, that's a really good point about some of those cheaper platoon type players like Ron Coomer in the 90 set. Matt Mieske is another guy that's really popular, lefty killer in the 90 set. I think when I was a new player, I was really surprised that I wasn't getting players like that on my draft card. And I came to realize with experience, like the sharks out there know that these are the guys that you can help build your team with, get real value with a cheap salary, even as a platoon player. So you have to, like you said, you got to go into the top 10, top 12 for those players, or you're just simply not going to get them.
And the 90 set is my favorite, my most played set. That's my era. That's the one I grew up in the most. But if you take a look, and Tony, you mentioned it, there's been a couple of times where so you said Larry Walker wasn't picked. That happens. I probably 50% of the times I play a 90s league, like Larry Walker or Jeff Bagwell just aren't picked. They're just not picked because people value that set has been picked apart by so many people. I mean, Tony Clark is a really good example. You get the right year on a Tony Clark year in the 90s, he's just as good as any first baseman out there.
Yeah.
And he's gonna give you lots of value, and some of those, relief pitchers out there, some of those, if you hit the right guy, if you hit a Gabe White on the right year, he's just as good as anybody else in that set. So, and again, yeah, you're right. The point I'm making is, if you know your set and you know it right, you can end up with a really good team, really stealing players away from other players who are just not in the know.
And, I fell into that sometime too, right? Like a Sean Figgins. I mean, he was not a guy that I would normally have drafted, but then he was a comparable salary to somebody that I would. And I got to know that guy. And, he's not a great defensive player, but in a DH year, if he's a fast guy that can get on base, and he walks a lot, and like you learn that as you go, right? So if it's not a guy you're targeting at that point, you get quote unquote stuck or given a player that can turn out better, right? Then you learn that player. So the next time, then do I want to put that guy on my card, or do I want to put him in my top 10 or 12? So my point is, by getting these comparable guys with the computer shuffling them to you, there's guys I wouldn't think to even try to get that I wouldn't think it would add any value. And then once they do, does that make sense? Then now I know that guy. So that's all part of knowing the set, right?
Yep.
I've had leagues where if you didn't get in the 2020 actual, if you didn't get Haggerty in the first 4 picks, you weren't going to get him. He is such a value as a left-handed fielder that can play with some defense. And he's going to hit 300 for you. And he is gone all the time. He is gone very early. So I think that fits really kind of exactly what we're talking about. Okay, we will be right back with more after this.
You're listening to the 365 Sportscast Network, the streaming future of sports talk radio. Listen to us round the clock on the net over 365sportscast.com. On your phone with the 365 Sportscast app, and on your favorite smart speaker by enabling the 365 Sportscast skill and saying, "Play 365 Sports." The views, opinions, and content of the show hosts and their guests appearing are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of 365 Sportscast LLC, its owners and partners, or this network.
Sir Strat of the Round Table.
Okay, we are back. And I thought of a couple other little questions that I wanted us to kind of go over and to get you guys' opinions on. The first one I thought of is top of your auto draft list versus the bottom of your auto draft list. Okay, let's start with you, Sir Tony.
I really don't, to be honest with you. In total honesty, I don't. I mean, I'm more of a guy that's looking for defensive players. If there's a good defensive player that can hit well, I'll put him to the top, even if he's don't really look at salary at all there. But I've had success in the bottom of my draft. Like the very last guy I got was like one of my utility guys who turned out to be pretty good in the end. Didn't cost very much. So I really don't like parallel the top to the bottom very much, because I'm not a guy like these other two guys here on the table, and you too, Sir James. Like, I'm a little different, a dance to bone drummer, and I'm set in my ways. So like, I'm more looking at my defensive players at these positions that I want to get first. And then towards the bottom, then I'll just take my chances. It's usually pitchers at the bottom, because like I said, I'm not sold on pitchers. I'll put a really good starter in the top 10. I'll put a really good reliever in the top 10. And the rest, if I'm in a good ballpark, I'll try to get marginal pitchers that fit that, where the defense makes them better if I get those defensive guys. So in answer to your question, for me personally, I really don't pay much attention to the top to the bottom. That's pretty much how I do mine.
What about you, Sir John?
Yeah, so top to bottom, I mean, as we've talked about before, the building your team around your stadium is important. I usually go for the power teams in a power stadium, but I do value the defense up the middle. I tend to take pitchers that have low, opponent batting average, but maybe a lot of walks. So I like that middle infield defense. So like at the very top, I'm taking those obvious, star players, especially, middle infield and center field, and it's the real obvious guys a lot, where it's like, Willie Mays in the 60s mystery, or Joe Morgan in the 70s mystery at the top. And then, those other type of star players there. And then probably in the next tier, I'll go after those, some of those platoon players that we talked about that, it's not the same for everybody, but we talked about, the guys like the Matt Niesky types, where if you really want them, you got to go after them early. Like that's probably in that next tier. And then, the third section is probably filling up my roster with guys that I think I can get at that point in the draft and that fit into my cap. And then at the very bottom, what I'll try and do, again, I'm very conscious of the waiver, priority, if I can help that out, say positions 22 to 24, unless there's really something on the bench that I'm looking for, I might take players at that point that are those cheaper defensive players that I know everyone's trying to get, or cheap pitchers that I know everyone's trying to get. So that if I don't get them, I'm getting a couple of more points towards that waiver situation. So Sir Tony mentioned guys like, Pat Sheridan and, Tony Scott and Gerald Young. They're very popular in the 80s mystery set, just as defensive replacements or backups in the outfield. If I fill them out at the very bottom of my list, often I might get one, which is good. And if I don't get any of them, well, there's, maybe 6 more points to add to my waiver priority and help me out there.
What about you, Sir Peter?
So my top five, in my top five, I always have probably my top 2 relievers, my number 1, depending on the set, shortstop, and then my number 1 starter for sure. The guy my ace, the guy I want is my ace. And then really, that 5th position is really just dependent on set. So, if it's maybe an 80s mystery set, it may end up being a, Wade Boggs type guy, because I really value his defense and his offense there. Really, the only time I ever vary from that strategy, every once in a while, I will go through, especially in the 90 set, I will go through, and this is one of my favorite strategies. I draft Bonds, Griffey, and Walker 1, 2, and 3. And then my 4 and 5 guys are Trevor Hoffman and Rob Dibble. I like to play with that team every once in a while, and I've actually surprisingly get those guys a lot of the times. I get all 5 of those guys, which is kind of fun to play with. But the bottom 5, I don't necessarily have a strategy. The bottom 5, the guys that I value the least, and it's a lot of the time it's that extra reliever that you just don't need. But you have to draft for, it's your mop-up guy. It's your, if I'm going with the 4 asterisk pitchers, it's the 50, it's the $500,000 pitcher starter that you just have to have. 5th bench guy that you have to hit your roster minimum. So those are the guys that I just don't care about. They're interchangeable. They'll never get any at bats. They really won't play. They just won't factor into my team. But my 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, top 5 will always fit that formula for me.
For me, in the top, I'm going to always have to try to do something in my middle infield, probably a shortstop or a second base or a center fielder, which is good if whichever position has the least. There's going to be, some quality relief maybe in that top, depending on how much relief. And then it's going to be some type of platoon situation where I think I can really take advantage. Something where I could believe that I can get two guys very cheap that are worth more together than a guy that's the same value that's more. If I can get a guy that's $2 million and a guy that's $4 million, and together his card looks like a guy that's $8 million, I'm gonna. And if there's not a bunch of those guys in the set that can do that, or I like to play platoons at catcher, I'm gonna maybe put some catchers up there pretty dang early. One that just hits very strong righty, very strong lefty, because I want to make sure I'm getting those pieces that I want that advantage. And then a lot of times at the end of mine, dude, I've got a bunch of guys in there worth a ton of cash that I'm like, you know what, I might get them if they fall to me. If not, I know there's a lot of guys like that. I'm probably gonna get a guy like that somewhere. So I kind of do that a little bit backwards, I think, than a lot of people. I might have some cheaper guys in that first 5 to 10 because I want to make sure I have that little piece that I think that gives me that advantage in that set. And I think, I find those guys in the different sets. Okay, guys, thank you so much for being here with us today. Dude, I think we've covered a lot of areas about AutoDraft, and I think it's something, being very specific to Strat-O-Matic, that it's something that isn't very well covered. It's touched on in different ways, but it itself isn't talked about that much, I think. So, and like I said, I think there's a lot of misconceptions on how the whole thing works and on what is a good strategy. I don't think there are a lot of people that are new playing it that would be thinking about, hey, let me put a more expensive player down lower, because if I'm not getting him, I'm blocking him from someone else because he's on my list. So, yep. Okay, dude. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Sir Tony.
Thank you, James, for having me. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Sir Peter.
Always a pleasure, my friend.
And thank you, John. Sir John.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me.
Have a great night. We'll be back after this.
You're listening to the 365 Sportscast Network, the streaming future of sports talk radio. Listen to us round the clock on the net over 365sportscast.com. On your phone with the 365 Sportscast app, and on your favorite smart speaker by enabling the 365 Sportscast skill and saying, "Play 365 Sports." The views, opinions, and content of the show hosts and their guests appearing are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of 365 Sportscast LLC, its owners and partners, or this network.
A huge thank you today to our roundtable, Sir Peter, Sir Tony, and Sir John. Thanks to our regular cast of characters, Carolyn Snyder, Joaquin Lewis III, Jimmy Dees, Andrew Burkham, and of course our music man, Jeff Teczon. All the music you heard today was written and performed by Jeff. A big thank you to you guys, the listeners. Check out all of our social media. We have some special things coming up, and we really want to be able to share them with you. Hey, Jeff, would you play us out, my brother?
You got it, Jimmy James.
Find us every Saturday, 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific, on 365 Sportscast radio streaming service. Download the app. Makes it crazy easy to listen. See you next week. Same Strat time, same Strat channel.
You're listening to the 365 Sportscast Network, the streaming future of sports talk radio. Listen to us round the clock on the net over 365sportscast.com. On your phone with the 365 Sportscast app, and on your favorite smart speaker by enabling the 365 Sportscast skill and saying, "Play 365 Sports." The views, opinions, and content of the show hosts and their guests appearing are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of 365 Sportscast LLC, its owners and partners, or this network.